Hello, lovelies. Welcome to Midnight on Call. I'm your host, Andy Who, and the Doctor's End. Tonight I'm going to be reading The Devil and Tom Walker. So, as long as you're watching, as long as you're listening, why don't you go ahead and pull the covers a little closer. Maybe cuddle with a stuffed teddy bear. A few miles from Boston, in Massachusetts, there is a deep inlet winding several miles into the interior of the country from Charles Bay and terminating in a thickly wooded swamp or morass. On one side of this inlet is a beautiful dark grove. On the opposite side, the land rises abruptly from the water's edge into a high ridge on which grow a few scattered oaks of great age and immense size. It was under one of these gigantic trees, according to old stories, that Kidd the pirate buried his treasure. The inlet allowed a facility to bring the money at night to the very foot of the hill. The elevation of the place permitted a good lookout to be kept that no one was at hand, while the remarkable trees formed good landmarks by which the place might easily be found again. The old stories add, moreover, that the devil presided at the hiding of the money and took it under his guardianship. But this, it is well known, he always does with buried treasure, particularly when it has been ill-gotten. Be that as it may, Kidd never returned to recover his wealth, being shortly after seized at Boston, sent out to England, and there hanged as a pirate. About the year 1727, just as the Lent in New England, and shook many tall sinners down upon their knees, there lived near this place a meager, miserly fellow, of the name of Tom Walker. He had a wife as miserly as himself. They were so miserly that they even conspired to cheat each other. Whether the woman could lay hands on, Whatever the woman could lay hands on, she hid away. A hen could not cackle, but she was on the alert to secure the newly-laid egg. Her husband was continually prying about to detect her secret hoards, where the conflicts that took place about what ought to have been common property. They lived in a forlorn-looking house that stood alone and had an air of starvation. A few straggling savin trees, emblems of sterility, grew near it. No smoke ever curled from its chimney. No traveler stopped at its door. A miserable corpse, whose ribs were as articulate as the bars of the gridiron, stalked about a field, where a thin carpet of moss scarcely covered the ragged beds of pudding-stone. Tantalized and balked his hunger, and sometimes he would lean his head over the fence, look piteously at the passerby, seemed to petition deliverance from this land of famine. The house and its inmates had altogether a bad name. Tom's wife was a tall termagant, fierce of temper, loud of tongue-knack, strong of arm. Her voice was often heard in wordy warfare with her husband, and his face sometimes showed signs that their conflict were not confined to words. No one ventured, however, to interfere between them. The lonely wayfarer shrunk within himself at the horrid clamor and clapper-cry, eyed the den of discord askance, and hurried on his way, rejoicing as a bachelor in his celibacy. One day that Tom Walker had been to a distant part of the neighborhood. He took what he considered a shortcut homeward through the swamp. Like most shortcuts, it was an ill-chosen route. The swamp was thickly grown with great green pines and hemlocks, some of them 90 feet high, which made it dark at noonday and a retreat for all the owls of the neighborhood. It was full of pits and quagmires, partly covered with weeds and mosses, where the green surface often betrayed the traveler into a gulf of black, smothering mud. There were also dark and stagnant pools, the abodes of the tadpole, the bullfrog, and the water snake, and where trunks of pines and hemlock lay half drowned, half rotting, looked like alligators sleeping in the mire. Tom had long been picking his way cautiously through this treacherous forest, stepping from tough rushes and roots, which afforded precarious footholds among deep sloughs, or pacing carefully like a cat among the prostrate trunks of trees, startled now and then by the sudden screaming of the bittern, or the quacking of a wild duck rising on the wing from some solitary pool. At length he arrived at a piece of firm ground which ran out like a peninsula into the deep bosom of the swamp. It had been one of the strongholds of the Indians during their wars with the first colonists. Here they had thrown up a kind of fort, which they had looked upon as most impregnable, and had used as a place of refuge and children. Nothing remained of the Indian fort but a few embankments gradually sinking to the level of the surrounding earth, and already overgrown in part by oaks and other forest trees, the foliage of which formed a contrast to the dark pines and hemlocks of the swamp. It was late in the dusk of evening, and he paused there for a while to rest himself. Anyone but he would have felt unwilling to linger in this lonely, melancholy place, for the common people had a bad opinion of it from the stories handed down from the time of the Indian Wars, when it was asserted that the savages held incantations here and made sacrifices to the evil spirit. Tom Walker, however, had any fears of the kind. Excuse me. He reposed himself for some time on the trunk of a fallen hemlock, listening to the boding cry of the tree toad, and delving with his walking staff into a beat. As he turned up the soil unconsciously, his staff struck against something hard. He raked it out of the vegetable mold, and lo, a cloven skull with an Indian tomahawk buried deep in it lay before him. The rest on the weapon showed the time that had elapsed since the death blow had been given. It was a dreary memento of the fierce struggle that had taken place in this last foothold of the Indian warriors. "Humph," said Tom Walker as he gave the skull a kick to shake the dirt off of it. "Skull alone," said a gruff voice. Tom lifted up his eyes and beheld a great black man seated directly opposite of him on the stump of a tree. He was exceedingly surprised, having neither seen nor heard anyone approach, on observing, as well as the gathering gloom would permit, that the stranger was neither Negro nor Indian. It is true he was dressed in a rude hat Indian garb, had a red belt or sash swathed around his body, but his face was neither black nor copper color, but swarthy and dingy, and begrimed with soot, as if he had been accustomed to toil among fires and forges. He had a shock of coarse black hair that stood out from his head in all directions, and bore an axe on his shoulder. He scowled for a moment at Tom with a pair of great red eyes. "What are you doing on my grounds?" said the black man with a hoarse, growling voice. "Your grounds," said Tom with a sneer. "No more your grounds than mine. They belong to Deacon Peabody." "Be damned," said the stranger. "As I flatter myself he will be if he does not look more to his own sins and less to his neighbors. Look yonder and see how Deacon Peabody is faring." Tom looked in the direction that the stranger pointed out, and beheld one of the great gems flourishing without, but rotten at the core, and saw that it had been nearly hewn through, so that the first high wind was likely to blow it down. One of the bark of the tree was scored the name of Deacon Peabody. He now He now looked around and found most of the tall trees marked with the names of some great men of the colony, floored by an axe. The one on which he had been seated, and which had evidently been hewn down, bore the name of Frauenshield, and he recollected a mighty rich man of that name who made a vulgar display of wealth, which it was whispered he had acquired. "He's just ready for burning," said the black man with a growl of triumph. "You see, I am likely to have good stock of firewood for winter." But what right have you, said Tom, to cut down Deacon Peabody's timber? "The right," said the other. "This woodland belonged to me long before one of your white-faced race put foot on my soil." "And pray, who are you, if I may be so bold?" said Tom. "Oh, I go by various names. I am the wild huntsman in some countries, the black miner in others, and known by the name of the black woodsman. I am he to whom the red men devoured the spot, and now and then roasted a white man by way of sweet-smelling sacrifice. Since the red men have been exterminated by you white savages, I amuse myself by presiding at the persecution of Quakers and Anabaptists. I am the great patron and prompter of slave dealers and the grand master of the sick. John of all, which is that, if I mistake not, said Tom sturdily. You are he commonly called Old Scratch. The same at your service, replied the black man with a half-civil nod. Sense was the opening of this interview. According to the old story, though, it was almost too familiar an air to be credited. One would think that to meet with such a singular personage in this wild, lonely place would have shaken any man's nerves. But Tom was a hard-minded fellow, not easily daunted, and he had lived so long with a termagant wife that he did not even fear the devil. It is said that after this commencement they had a long and earnest conversation together as Tom returned homeward. The black man told him of great sums of money which had been buried by Kit the pirate under the oak trees on the high ridge not far from the morass. All these were under his command and protected by his power so that none could find them but such as propitiated his favor. These he offered to place within Tom Walker's reach, having concealed him that they were to be had only on certain conditions. What these conditions were may easily be surmised, though Tom never disclosed them publicly. They must have been very hard, for he required time to think of them, and he was not a man to stick at trifles where money was used. When they had reached the edge of the swamp, the stranger paused. "Why, that all you have been telling me is true," said Tom. "Here is my signature," said the black man, pressing his finger on Tom's forehead. So saying, he turned off among the thickets of the swamp and seemed, as Tom said, to go down, down, down into the earth until nothing but his head and shoulders could be seen, and so on until he totally disappeared. And that is where we shall stop for this evening, for it is late, and night hangs upon us. Now get some sleep.